Hey, Ryan Martin here with another video about Collegiate Shag. This video was inspired by a comment that a friend left in one of the forums where all of us shag nerds talk online. And he asked basically, so what do you guys use as your content in your beginner classes? What do you do? How do you teach a beginner class? And some very interesting comments came out of that, and it reminded me that I've been meaning to make a video like this about certain things that I don't think get covered very often. And this speaks directly to the social aspect of shag. And as we all know, if we want it to grow, thrive, evolve, we've got to promote the social aspect of shag, collegiate shag. So I want to touch on a few topics that relate to that. In order to do this, I wanted to have some visuals, demonstrations. So I invited over, well, my wife and I invited over our friends the Robinsons, who also teach collegiate shag. So Joe and Tabitha are the perfect couple for this because of their height. So if you can see here, I'm the tallest, Megan's the shortest, and then the Robinsons fit somewhere in between. So they're much closer in height than Megan and I are. This is an important point because height differences socially are going to affect things like posture, connection, stuff like that. I think a lot of the things that we see on videos and clips in contests and stuff, you've got these partnerships where the dancers are very close in height. Especially in a lot of the vintage clips, the lead and the follow are near the same height, so they're able to do certain things aesthetically that just aren't practical for the social dance floor if you ever encounter a situation where you're a lot taller or a lot shorter than the person you're dancing with. So if you put me with Tabitha, like this is what you get. If you put me with Megan, this is what you get, right? And if you put Joe and Tabitha together, this is what you get. Right, now Joe's slightly shorter than me. If he dances with Megan, this is what it looks like. So you get a whole range here of different handholds and heights and everything else. This is a good spectrum to demonstrate how height differences affect social dancing. Now, let's start with the topic of posture and what we tell our students in class with respect to posture. The idea here is that when you're teaching your students about body postures and stuff like that, you want to teach them things that are going to work universally on the social dance floor. This right here, what you see, this sailor basic, is a pretty neat move, right? But if you put somebody like myself with my wife Megan here, it gets kind of goofy, like, because I've got to stoop way down, right? So obviously you're not going to ask people to do this on a regular basis. This is not going to be like your default basic. Generally speaking, I think when you're close, your partners are closer together is probably going to work best. If you're further apart from your partner, say like you see in the Arthur Murray video on shag from way back, being this far away from your partner is something that the students tend to do because they don't know each other in class. I'm sure you guys had experiences with this. I think we need to challenge this because it's going to make it more difficult for them to connect, and I think it's harder for them to just relax whenever they're doing the basic. The shag arm is the next thing I think we should discuss because that's also affected by height. So this one I think is a little more obvious, and more teachers are aware of this in class. Ideally, you and your partner are going to be closer in height, and you're going to be able to stick your arms straight up like you see in the old clips, you know. But this doesn't always work out socially. And for somebody like myself who's rather tall, and my partner and wife Megan who's considerably shorter than me, this doesn't work out so well. What ends up happening is it looks like I'm pulling her up by her arm, and it's just generally not very comfortable. So what we'll usually do is crook our arm rather than pointing it straight up. If you're closer in height, it seems to work better, and they can get their hand up much higher. Kind of looks cool. But when teaching beginners about shag and about this, unique aspect of shag, I think it's probably best to introduce them to the idea that crooking your arm, lowering your arm a little bit is not a bad thing. So this brings us to the topic of connection between partners. So the majority of the shag dancers that I know connect through their frame. So like my right hand on the follow's back, connecting that way. Other folks think that it's best to have a body connection. So similar to Balboa, they try to connect directly to the chest. Tabitha and I tested this out because we're closer in height, and we did the old Balboa test where you get into a Balboa posture and then don't use your arms, you just connect to the chest and you do the basic. It works. Everybody's amazed, and it's like, oh, I see, yes, of course we're supposed to connect to the chest. Now, if you try this with shag, there's a little bit of rattling between Tabitha and I, and it's not as comfortable. It just doesn't work as well without the arms. There are certain reasons why I think this might not be the best thing to convey to students, not just because of height, but because I don't think a true chest connection or body connection, if you want to call it that, really works in shag. The pulse is part of the reason that I don't think it works. I think that even for those who say that they connect through their body, they're actually connecting through the frame more than they realize. I highly recommend that when you're teaching your beginner level classes, you want to emphasize the connection between the lead's right hand and the follow's back, right? That's really the principal connection point in shag. All right, now moving on. Now let's talk about pulse. So I want to talk about this not only because pulse is so important for shag and that the shag pulse is unique among swing dances, but also because the way that we talk about it can be a little confusing sometimes. I remember having a conversation with a Lindy Hop friend of mine, and we were talking about the difference in shag and Lindy in the pulse, and I referred to shag's pulse as an up pulse. This can be confusing. It's a good term to say up pulse. I think it works. It's convenient, but that can confuse folks who aren't familiar with it. So in shag, as we all know, pulse uses our ankles a lot, and we pulse from the balls of our feet. And that's why we say our pulse is up. But we mark the beat with our feet in exactly the same way that Balboa and Lindy Hoppers do. In other words, our heels hit the lowest point or strike the ground on the beat, just like Lindy, just like Balboa. The thing that's different is that we use our ankles more when we do that. So usually when Megan and I are teaching a beginner class, we will start out with the pulse. We will just, on our own, without connecting with each other, we'll stand there and we'll demonstrate the shag pulse, usually doing quicks or slows, and we'll just have everybody in the class imitate us to get that down. Then we'll explain to them, now for those of you that do Lindy and Balboa, don't forget how to do your Lindy and Balboa pulse too. Just treat this as a separate language. The pulse in shag is one of the things that makes it unique and it's different. But you don't want that to infect your other dances. You want to treat them all like separate, unique and beautiful languages, right? So yeah, pulse, very important. I highly recommend talking about it from the get-go at the very beginning of class. Okay, now final topic is the basic turn in shag. So many moons ago, my old partner and I, Tracy, made a video that covered shag fundamentals and mechanics, right? And we'd been teaching for a few years at the time. Inevitably, you learn things over the years, and the way that you do stuff sometimes changes, and this is one example of that. So we did the turn different back then. We didn't know any better. So what we would do is she would pretty much keep her arm all the way up when we would do the turn, and I would just, I've got long arms, so I would just kind of go with it. But it didn't work out real well because what we would do is tell people to make sort of like a C shape with your hand, and her hand would kind of like rotate inside of it and all this kind of stuff. But it doesn't work out real well because there's this gap, so you can lose the connection. So later we developed a better way of doing it. So what we do now is rather than keeping our arms really high up whenever we do the turns, we bring them down. So if, and this touches on the whole height thing again, if say I'm dancing with a shorter follow and we're going to do a turn, I will lower my arm so that it's like around the level of her crown, right? Before I do the turn. You're still turning with the right hand on her back. That's still the mechanism that, initiates or leads the turn to actually happening. But the shag arm here, that hand is going to connect with her hand in a different way than the way we used to do it. So if the follow flattens her hand out, and I think some folks do this in Lindy Hop, flattens her hand out when she's turning, right? You have this opportunity to use the fingers as a connection point. Because if you do it that way, when she comes back around, the hand flips over and you conveniently find that the back of her hand is in your palm, and it keeps that connection without hitting that dead point where there's nothing to keep the connection. So in a sense, your hand, your shag arm is following hers as it goes over her head, right? If you're going to do a double turn, it's very easy to lead the double turn by simply flipping your wrist during that time rather than in other words, she's not going to feel, when you reach the opposite point where the fingertips are connected, she's not going to feel your frame contracting to bring her back in. Instead, she's going to feel a flip of the hand to do an additional turn. That's a convenient way to get double turns to happen and make them very clear. Because as we all know, with shag, you've got this arm up in the air and you're doing an outside turn, so it gets kind of awkward because your right hand here is the one that initiates the turn, but because of the way that the turn is, because of the way the motion works and everything, there's this awkwardness about where do I put my hand to stop her, to let her know that the turn is stopping. If you're doing the inside turn in Balboa, it's really easy. You just put your hand on her back. But with this outside turn with the arm in the air, it's just a little bit more awkward. You have to depend upon your connection in the shag arm to let the follow know that the turn is over. And I think the best way to do that is to try to maintain the connection throughout the turn as best you can. And this is the way that we found works best, through that flat hand and the finger connection when she reaches the opposite end. And then when she comes back around, it just conveniently, the back of her hand ends up in your palm.